My name is Julia Dias Leite. I'm the Executive Director of CEBRI. I have here in the call Sérgio Fausto from Fundação Fernando Henrique Cardoso, Arthur Kroeber, partner of Gavegal Dragonomics, who is also an old partner of CEBRI. We've been organizing seminars every year. And also Ambassador Marcos Caramuru, who is the member of International Board of CEBRI and as well partner of Quemu Consultoria. Thank you all for being here today. I'll pass now the word to Sergio, who will conduct the debate.
Well, hello. Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much, Julia, for co-organizing this webinar with us. Thank you so much, Arthur and Marcus, for making the time to spend an hour discussing such a relevant topic. Well, at the present moment, it's hard to imagine a more relevant topic than the one that will be addressed today. China, the coronavirus, and the challenges of interconnected world. This virus is a global virus. It knows no national borders. It has infected the global economy. The epicenter was China, then the epicenter moved to Europe. Now it is in the US. It's hitting hard Latin America. It will be hitting hard Africa. So this is a global crisis. But we're going to focus today China, not only as the first epicenter of the pandemic, but as the second largest economy in the world, and extremely interconnected with the two other countries or blocks that are part of this, the core of the global economy, the European Union and the United States. Arthur, I think you are in a unique position to address the topics that are on the table today. How China is responding to the pandemic. Is it set to recover? Will China be affected, and then how it will be affected by global recession, how China's performance will affect the global economy. And at the end of the talk, of your presentation, I presume you're going to tackle sort of long-term implications of this crisis, particularly the relationship between the US and China at the geopolitical level. Marcos Caramuru, a very old friend who has been living in China for almost 10 years, has served as Brazilian ambassador to Malaysia and to Beijing, knows China very well, will make comments on Arthur's presentation. So without further ado, Arthur will talk for about 25 minutes, comments from Marcos for about 15 minutes, then we're going to open a Q&A. People who are interested in sending questions, please do it through the device that you have at the bottom of the screen, Q&A. You can also send questions through the Facebook page of Fundação Fernando Henrique Cardoso, and by some miraculous way, the questions will arrive at my desk, and I will try to ask these questions as much as I can. I will ask Arthur and Marcos to answer to those questions. So the floor is yours, Arthur, for about 25 minutes.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Julia and Sergio, for that very kind introduction. And I'm really looking forward to exchanging views with Ambassador Caramuru on this and to entertaining your questions. What I'm going to do is I'm going to spend just a few minutes outlining our understanding of the dynamics of this disease and the epidemic, because I think that's a really important background. Then I'll focus on the economic impacts both in China and globally. And finally, as Sergio suggested, I'll conclude with some comments on the geopolitical, longer-term geopolitical ramifications of this. So let me just see if I can get my slides up here. Oops, that's the agenda for today. We don't need that. There we go. All right, so I hope everyone can see the slide presentation that I have here. So the basic outline of my views is that we have to take this epidemic very seriously and understand that it's going to create a pretty significant a recession in most major economies. We're already seeing massive declines in economic activity in the US and Europe. And I think the other key thing to recognize is that the recovery from this will not be a sharp, as they say, V-shaped recovery. It will be slow and gradual. So I think for much of the year, we'll be dealing with the economic impact of this epidemic. It's important to look at what's going on in China because I think that helps us understand what is likely to happen in the rest of the world. And as you can see here, my major concern in the long run is that rather than providing an avenue for a reduction in tensions between the world's two largest economies, China and the US, I fear that it will make things even worse in that relationship. So first, let me just spend a couple minutes on the disease itself. I and my team have been spending a lot of time trying to sort through all of the data on this and to separate out the truth from all of the strange claims that are out there. And I think the key points are really these, which I've put up on the screen. The first is there's a lot of discussion about the fatality rates. It's very difficult to determine what they are, but the crucial thing is that we now know for a certainty that if the disease is unchecked, it is severe enough to completely overwhelm local hospital systems. And that's what we saw in Wuhan in China. That's what we saw in Lombardy in Italy. And that is what we're seeing now in real time in New York City. So it is, whatever the fatality rate winds up being, it is extremely severe and it can really wreak havoc in public health systems. And so the public health responses that you're now seeing in Europe and the United States are designed to prevent a repetition of the disasters that you saw in Wuhan and Lombardy. So this is a very, very serious thing, and the responses will be serious. The second major point is that we have a pretty good general idea of what works and on what time scale. So if you look at countries in East Asia like Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea, they acted very early. They tested a lot of people. They tracked their contacts. They isolated or quarantined the affected cases. And because they acted very early and massively, they didn't have to disrupt their economy so much. China acted much later, and so they were forced essentially to shut down their entire economy, and we're only just beginning to get back to something close to normal there. And the US and Europe are acting even later than China. So they have to do these massive lockdowns, and they may last longer. The good news is that when you do start to do these lockdowns, the effectiveness comes very quickly. The bad news is that the restrictions need to stay in place for a long time. So let me just show you a few charts to illustrate this idea. So you can see China locked down on January 23rd, and within a couple of weeks, this had a very dramatic impact on the rate of new cases, both in Hubei, the epicenter, and in the broader country. And you can see the rest of the world is nowhere close to getting to the point that China was at 2 months ago. These are curves on the left for the cases in different regions, and on the right, the fatalities. The fatalities data is probably more important because we know for sure who died from COVID-19. Cases are subject to different definitions, and that data is fuzzier. So if you look at the right-hand chart, you can see China and South Korea both very successful in leveling the curve very early. United States and Europe growing much more quickly. You can see the curve in Europe beginning to get a little bit more gentle. So we think that will start to level off fairly soon, but the United States still is seeing accelerating deaths. So we've got a long way to go before this is contained in the US and Europe. This is a curve showing the acceleration of new cases. And this is, if you do it right, this is what you get. You get a very steady declining curve of new cases, as we saw in China and in South Korea. And what you can see in the US and in Europe is that the curves have started to decline, but they're much higher. You're still seeing acceleration rates of over 20%. And you don't have this kind of steep, steady decline in cases. So again, we're far away from getting the epidemic under control. The deaths in Europe used to be concentrated in Italy, but you can see now that deaths outside of Italy exceed those inside Italy, so it's becoming a much broader European problem. In the US, it's more ambiguous. There's clearly a huge problem in New York. We don't yet know for sure how bad it's going to get in the rest of the country. And then finally, this is sort of what I would call a best case model of how things could happen in the US. It's done by researchers at the University of Washington. And what it shows is that if the US does everything right and locks down the entire country and does it for 2 months to the end of May, then you'll get that curve on the left, which peaks in the middle of April and then a steady decline. And by the end of May or early June, you'll be in pretty good shape. The problem is that the US hasn't done a full national lockdown, so this probably is too optimistic, and we're likely to see this epidemic go longer in the United States. So to conclude on this part, it's very important to look at the experience of how China reacted to the virus and the economic cost there, because we're basically going to see the same things play out again in Europe, in the United States. Second thing is, you may have read a lot about, treatments, vaccines, and so forth. There are no silver bullets here. This is just something we're going to have to get through. There are no treatments or vaccines that are going to be available at any time in the next few months. So we just have to do social controls to get the virus under control. And then the final question is, once the US has fully imposed these social controls, how will they get out of this lockdown, which is very economically costly? And I think that will be a difficult discussion. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the economic impacts. And you probably know in general terms that these are large, but maybe these charts will show you how large. So this is figures for China. We don't have the GDP numbers for the first quarter this year, but my team has constructed a model, and you can see the lines are very steady, and they've shown over the last several years there's been a steady, slow deceleration of GDP growth. And then you can look down to the right, and that straight line down is what we're projecting for this year. And I have to say, our model, we're expecting GDP growth of -3 or 4% for Q1. Many other forecasters have worse numbers ranging from 5 to 10%. So the confidence level around these predictions is not very high, but anywhere from 2 or 3 to 9 or 10% reduction in GDP growth in Q1 is likely. And you're going to see similar things in the United States. So here you see jobless claims in red. These are people who are filing for unemployment insurance. These correlate quite well, as you can see, historically with GDP growth. And it is the collapse in employment is consistent with a quarter-to-quarter decline of GDP in the US of about 20%. So the difference between the Q2 GDP in the US and the Q1 GDP could be as much as 20%. If we look at Europe, you basically get very similar numbers. And again, the way in which we're measuring is different, but you're going from GDP growth of somewhere 1.5% to -5%, something like that. So now let's turn back to China and see how they're responding. And you can see these are some high frequency indicators that we have of activity in China. So I'm getting a message. Is there a problem seeing the slides, or can people see them?
I can see them perfectly well.
Okay.
Me neither.
No
Yes?
one else has complained about it, so I think you should carry on.
Okay, very good. Okay, thank you. So these are high frequency indicators of Chinese activity, and you can see everything fell off a cliff and was very low in early February. And then in March, we started to see a very steady improvement. But broadly speaking, when we look at everything all the information that we have, our best guess is that China today is operating at about 75% of its normal economic capacity. And we think that it will be another month at least before we're up to 100%. A lot of companies are open for business, but they only have half of their employees coming each day. A lot of companies are open, but they have like 10 or 15 or 20% of their normal level of business. So a lot of activity has restarted, but it's nowhere near the same level as it would normally be. The other thing is that China's exports have held up pretty well, but they are going to be hit very badly because as the rest of the world goes into recession, we can expect that they will buy a lot less Chinese stuff. In the global financial crisis of 2008 and 2009, China's exports fell by 20% from the peak to the trough. I think all the information we have now is that this economic shock will be stronger, bigger than the 2008-2009 shock. And so as you can see, we're forecasting anywhere from a 20 to a 60% decline in Chinese exports to the US and Europe, which together account for close to half of Chinese exports. So even if in the unlikely circumstance that China's exports to the rest of the world hold up reasonably well, you're still looking at a hit to exports that is at least as great as in 2008, 2009, and probably more. The other problem, and this is a problem not just in China, but in the US particularly and in Europe, these shutdowns are a real problem for small businesses that operate, on daily cash flows. They don't have a lot of reserves. They provide a lot of employment, and they basically have no way to survive. It's very difficult for them to survive an extended shutdown of the entire economy. So we don't have really great labor data in China, but the data that we have looks really bad. So there's been a big spike in the registered unemployment rate, and you can see in the red bars the number of newly created urban jobs, and a lot of these are in small and medium-sized enterprises. This has gone deeply negative. And this is one of the key reasons why I think the recovery, both in China and everywhere else, will be slow, because large swaths of the economies depend on small and medium-sized enterprises who are getting completely hammered by these lockdowns. And they cannot just snap their fingers and go back to business, turn on the switches, and have everything go. They are going to have a very long, slow, painful road to recovery. I think the other comment that I would like to make about China's economic position before I go on to the geopolitical and long-term responses is that unlike in 2008, 2009, we have seen a very, very small response in terms of economic policy from the Chinese government. You may recall 11 years ago when the global financial crisis hit, the Chinese government launched a massive stimulus program. The headline number was 4 trillion renminbi. Our estimates are that the actual increased credit and spending was closer to 15 trillion renminbi over a 2-year period. So it was really an extraordinary stimulus. And in subsequent down cycles in 2013 and 2016, we've seen smaller but analogous strong fiscal stimulus, mainly coming through infrastructure in the property sector. This time around, the Chinese government has basically done nothing. They have lowered interest rates a little bit, as you can see in the left chart, and they have let investment, even in infrastructure, go down. They've not made any effort to make infrastructure spending go up in response to this crisis. It's a little bit hard to see, but that red line of infrastructure is following the blue line down. And the arrow is what we expect will happen once they put some support for local government infrastructure spending into place. So we do think that they are beginning to mobilize a bit of an infrastructure response, but even so, we don't think that infrastructure spending is going to grow more than about 8 or 9% this year compared to last year. In 2009, the comparable figure was 40%. You had a 40% year-on-year growth in infrastructure spending. This year, it will be at best 8 or 9. So the question is, why are they responding in such a small way to this major economic crisis? And I think there are basically two reasons for that. One is that for many policymakers in China today, the stimulus of 2008, 2009 is viewed as a bad thing, that they overdid it, that they allowed too much irresponsible borrowing by local governments and companies, and that this created huge debt problems that the countries have to struggle with for the last decade. And for the last 3 years, the government has had a very strong effort to get rid of shadow financing and excessive debt, and to stop the debt to GDP ratio from growing. And so the policymakers, the Ministry of Finance and the NDRC and the State Council do not want a repetition of the kind of debt frenzy that you got in 2009. So they're very conservatively biased. And then I think the second reason is, frankly, they underestimated the economic impact of this. I think when they went into this, they thought, oh, we'll have to shut down the country for a month or so, but it's Chinese New Year's anyway, so not much happens in general. So this is a good time to shut things down. The loss of output won't be so bad. We'll get back to normal by beginning of April, and things will be fine. And so we don't really have to do that much. And so what I think is, first of all, they underestimated how long the country would have to shut down. Second, they underestimated what this shutdown was going to do in terms of crushing activity. And third, I think they did not realize that the epidemic would spread to the rest of the world, and the rest of the world would do the same thing and go into a global recession. So for all of those reasons, I think they have been behind the curve and insufficiently supportive of the economy. They are now starting to increase support from the central bank and via fiscal measures, but they're going to do this very cautiously. Okay, so in the remaining few minutes, I'd like to address three longer term issues that I think will come up as we exit from this crisis into whatever the new normal turns out to be. And the first of these is that I think that the whole, if you will, neoliberal economic model that has been dominant for the last 25 or 30 years, which is focused on efficiency above all, I think this is going to face a lot of criticism, because what we can see is that countries like China or other East Asian countries that have redundancies, maybe they're not the most efficient, but they have an ability to respond, mobilize resources and respond to a crisis. They've done relatively well, whereas the efficiency-oriented economies like the US have really had a chaotic and not very good response. And we don't have enough medical equipment, we don't have enough hospital beds, we don't have enough drugs. So the United States, I think, has a real reckoning to do with the balance between efficiency and resiliency. And I think there will be a lot more focus in building in resiliency and redundancy, that is extra capacity into the system, to make it safer, even if it's less efficient. So I think there's going to be a pretty big economic debate in the United States, but also more broadly about what's the right balance between economic efficiency and the things that you need to do to keep a country safe in all dimensions. Second, I think this whole notion of globalized supply chains is going to come under question. And this is a little trickier. So I think if you're looking at things like pharmaceutical supply chains, supplies of medical equipment, et cetera, there's a huge problem in the United States that we don't make most of this stuff anymore. We have to import it, often from China. Chinese local governments and companies have been working very hard to try and meet this demand, but it's very difficult to get through customs delays and other kinds of regulatory problems. So the flow of needed equipment and supplies from China and other places to the United States is a lot slower than it needs to be. So I think you're going to see enormous political pressure after this for the United States to relocalize its supply chains for pharmaceuticals and critical medical equipment. Now, this obviously feeds into the bigger dynamic that we've seen over the last 2 years, where Trump has led these trade wars based on the idea that the U.S. needs to, have less investment abroad, more investment in manufacturing at home. This idea of decoupling the Chinese and U.S. economies has been a very popular topic of conversation. But once you get beyond things like, pharmaceuticals and medical supplies into things like electronics, the case for decoupling becomes a lot harder. So, for example, Apple is reportedly very happy with the success of the Chinese response to COVID-19, and they're very skeptical that any other country that they could move to, Vietnam, Indonesia, India, would handle it as well. So from Apple's standpoint, one of the things this crisis shows is actually China is a good place to have your supply chain, because the government is pretty efficient at mobilizing a response to crisis. So I think in some areas there will be a lot of successful pressure to move supply chains out of China and back to the US. I think in other sectors, though, that you'll see a lot more resistance. So again, that will be a complicated debate. So then finally, we have the question of geopolitics. And I think you're already seeing in the public statements of both the Chinese government and the US government efforts to seize control of the narrative about the epidemic. So if we look first at the Chinese standpoint, the Chinese Communist Party has really labored very hard to promote the narrative that they led a people's war against this epidemic. It was very difficult, but under the leadership of the party, the Chinese people mobilized and they successfully defeated this huge disease. I think most people in China basically buy into that narrative and feel that the government did the right things and has done a good job. So from the standpoint of the party's domestic legitimacy, I think they have succeeded in making this a beneficial thing. And now they're engaged in an effort, first of all, to divert attention to the fact that the epidemic did start in China, that there were severe missteps in the handling of it in December and January, both bungling of the response and failure to disclose information that were very problematic and had very bad consequences for other countries. They're kind of pushing that into the background. And instead, they're trying to take a proactive role in sharing medical knowledge and supplies and so forth. And I think that proactive role is well merited and a good thing for them to do, but it is definitely a very selective reading of the total response of China to the virus. If you then look to the United States side, I think what you find is that the faction within the United States government that has been interested in pushing a very hard line, almost Cold War approach towards China, they basically see this as an opportunity to push ahead. And their narrative is, look, China mishandled and lied about the virus in the early days in December and January. There's now an intelligence report, which personally I think is probably pretty credible, that China has concealed or misrepresented its data about cases and fatalities in February and March. So basically the narrative is China is untrustworthy. We cannot deal with them. There's basically no basis for any kind of cooperation. And so therefore we just have to treat them as an adversary. And that narrative is gaining strength in Washington. It was already strong before this epidemic, and now it is even stronger. Now, that's not the only thing that's going on in the United States. There are other parts of the federal government that are, including the president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, that are trying to find a way for the US and China to work cooperatively. And it's also important to understand that at the local government level, the state level, there are a number of efforts underway by states to work with provinces and companies in China to import medical equipment and so forth, masks, and ventilators and so forth, and that these are somewhat successful, right? So it's a complicated story, but at the national level, I think there is a really significant risk that as we move through this, what will happen is that you get the crystallization of this basic narrative in Washington that China is an untrustworthy, dangerous player, and the US has to essentially move to a quasi-Cold War footing against it and treat it not as a competitor with a complex and nuanced relationship, but just as an adversary. And if that happens, I think that would be very bad. I think it would be bad for the United States. I think it would be bad for China, and I think it would be bad for the global economy. So I would just conclude here by saying that we're at a very difficult moment on many dimensions. Clearly, public health is the number one. Number two is just how do we get our economies back on track? That will be a very difficult task that will take most of the rest of the year, at least, to achieve. And then third, we have a real risk, not a certainty, but a real risk that this event becomes an excuse for a really damaging and unnecessary deterioration in the political and economic relationship between the two biggest economies in the world. So I think with that, I've exhausted my time, and I'm happy to turn it back to Sergio and Ambassador Caramuru for some other comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Arthur. Thank you for your excellent presentation. Now it's your turn, Marcos. 15 minutes.
Well, good evening to everyone. Thank you, Julia. Thank you, Sergio. It's a pleasure to share a panel with such a distinguished analyst, such as Arthur Kroeber. I'm very glad to be here. I'm going to make 3 comments connected or inspired by Arthur Kroeber's presentation. One about the Chinese economy, the second one about the opportunities that are open to China, and the last one very briefly about the China-US relationship and its impact and the impact of the pandemic on this relationship. First, about the economy. China has been making every effort to combat the economy and normalize, making the economy go back to a normal situation, providing liquidity to small and big banks in order to finance big companies, to finance, in particular, small and medium-sized companies, using budgeted resources, both at the federal level and at the local level, to increase the flow of resources to these companies. So for the time being, I think that this whole idea of disciplining the local banks and disciplining the fiscal accounts at the local level is going to be left aside. The strategy is going to be focused on making the economy go back to work. China has been increasing the deductions and relieving companies from their obligations, waiving social security obligations, delaying the payment of the housing fund, allowing companies to deduct all the losses connected to the coronavirus reality for 8 years in their tax presentations during 8 years. But there are 2 major points that are a priority to China and pose a challenge to China. One, Arthur already mentioned that, is how to deal with the very small companies that do not have access to the financial system because they cannot provide collateral, that sometimes have access to the shadow banking, but live out of their own daily cash, and the impact of the operation of these companies on unemployment. Very recently, the Prime Minister of China, Li Keqiang, said that it doesn't matter how the GDP performs. The major point for us is unemployment, and if the unemployment remains stable, we are not going to pay that much attention to the GDP performance. So, unlike 2008, when the basic concern, the basic preoccupation with labor had to do with migrant workers, with those who work in constructions and those who work in factories. Now, what worries China is the college graduated person, that if he or she doesn't find a position, will have to go back to this original city. And they have always thought that this is a major point to worry about and to pay attention to. So I think employment creation is the basic question. Now the question is, what's going to happen with GDP? There are many voices in China that say that China should abandon the idea of making a GDP target and work on operate reality as is. And this has an impact on the behavior of companies, and particularly SOEs, state-owned companies, because they are all base their projections and their strategies on the GDP target announced by the federal government. So there is a discussion in China how to deal with this reality, and this is going to be a very interesting change if China decides at the end of the day not to have for this year a GDP target. The second point that is really as a topic of different views in China, that raises different views in China, is what to do with the least assisted people in society. Just yesterday, there was a decision by the State Council to allocate 67 million to the least assisted. But again, how to do it is a big challenge. There are voices in China that say that the solution is just to copy the United States, send money directly to the individuals, but China so far has preferred to use the existing mechanisms, unemployment insurance, all the programs that already exist in connection to the poorest. But this is a point that is still going to be a point of discussion. So what I think is that, yes, the mid-sized companies and the large companies will clearly be able to reach agreements with the local authorities, with the federal banks, with the local banks that give them support. Small and medium-sized companies that have a connection with the banking sector will be protected, but the very small business in the big cities in particular, these are the ones that are going to be affected, and their impact on employment is going to be a central issue for China. And the discussion will be in China how to operate the assistance to these companies and the assistance to those that are going to be unemployed. My second comment is about the opportunities in the Chinese economy. We all know that in Chinese, the word for crisis, wei ji, has also the meaning of opportunity, ji, of ji hui. Ji hui is a word that means opportunity in China. And I think that China is going to build the opportunities in a double sense. First, to build its image in the world, or at least to avoid the damage to its image in the world. At the later stage, to increase its participation in the international economy in a more active and effective way. Now, we've been following the number of calls by Xi Jinping and by the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Wang Yi, to their counterparts in a number of different countries. It's very clear that China is following a strategy to reach all these countries, to talk at the high level authority, and to discuss the crisis, how China can support these countries, and also to discuss how to deal with the problems created in the context of the crisis. So far, China has announced 178 aid flights to at least 40 countries, carrying 2,600 tons of equipment and 100 doctors and staff to work in hospitals. So there's a campaign in China to help countries, to keep dialogue to a number of countries. And I think this is going to be a very important point. You know, China's image, China's opportunity to get closer to countries and to support them to the extent possible. As far as the opportunities open for the economy, if one looks at the 2008 crisis, one is going to see that it's from the 2008 crisis that China started its way as an important international investor. If you look at figures from 2009 onwards, you're going to see that the volume of ODI, of all overseas direct investments of China in different countries, has increased considerably. At the same time, China has become the first trade partner of a number of countries. Just take the example of Brazil. It was in 2009 that China became our first partner. And also it's from 2009 that we started to see a greater volume of investments of China in Brazil. Now, if you compare to 2008, China is now much better prepared. First, because the Chinese companies have acquired the experience of operating in different countries. Many companies, as we know, lost a lot of money in different countries. Many companies had gains, but China acquired an experience, and this is a very important point. The second point is that China also built some mechanisms that are going to support its participation in the economy in other countries, such as the Asian Investment Bank that did not exist in the 2008 crisis, and is going to be a very important instrument to help China, to help countries to increase their infrastructure investments. Now, this is going to happen in the context of a world where international discussions have lost the force of the past, where multilateral discussions are weakened, and many multilateral institutions are underperforming their roles. I don't see China as a leader in the multilateral discussions. I don't believe that China is going to build a world in which we are going to have stronger multilateral institutions and more countries participating in the discussion and a real clear international effort in that direction. I see China more and more into a bilateral connections with different countries, trying to help them, trying to use the opportunities opened in the economy and occupying a bigger space. And the opportunity is there for China to do this, because at the end of the day, nowadays, China is the major manufacturer of all these hospitals and medical equipments and medicines that we need to combat the crisis. And many countries, they know that they have to buy these equipment in China, but they are afraid of not finding the right suppliers there. So many countries are helping China to do sourcing for them. China has already signed agreement with 30 countries to provide them on a commercial basis with equipment, with material, with masks, with respirators, and so at this point in time, China is choosing who are going to be the suppliers, how they are going to be connected to different countries. In a way, they are managing trade in this area. In normal circumstances, countries or companies in other countries would be buying the market, following the normal market procedures. But now China is leading that. So at the same time that China is leading this international cooperation with countries, China is leading this whole effort to supply countries with the equipment they need to combat the crisis, and guiding as a leader, taking decisions, giving orientations, and even, as I said before, working as making the source work, identifying suppliers for these countries. You take the case of respirators. China has approximately 21 factories manufacturing respirators, 8 of which have their certificate. So they are guiding. They are really commanding this effort of exports. Final and very briefly, the point about China-US connection or disconnection in the aftermath of the crisis. I think there is a general belief in China that, if there's a consensus in the United States, is the consensus that they have to contain China. Democrats and Republicans have a very similar view in that direction. And I think that the Chinese very much agree that these are going to be, under any circumstances in the United States, these are going to be difficult times. This is going to be a difficult moment to China. China has been trying to respond to this with a very soft, attitude and soft statements in general. Take what happened 2 or 3 days ago when there was these accusations of lack of transparency in China about the numbers of deceased and the numbers of people infected by coronavirus. The spokesman of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs tried to make a positive statement saying that, well, China is worried about the situation in the United States, that they want to build cooperation in the United States. And I think that it's going to be a bumpy road. China is going to make every effort to avoid a more confrontational situation. The United States is going to be, to a certain extent, unpredictable, but I think this is going to be a bumpy road. And we are already used to, well, countries are already used to this, and we know already that, you know, this is a reality that we'll have to live with in the next few decades. My real concern is about those who are silent, those who are not participating, those who are not taking positions. China and the US reached an agreement about the first stage of the trade disputes. This agreement, in a number of points, many analysts and even countries believe that it goes against certain WTO rules. It creates a privileged dialogue between China and the United States in a number of areas like intellectual property rights or pharmaceutical industry development, but still there is a general silence. So my best expectation is that more countries that have had a tradition in participating in the international discussion and taking a leading position, such as Brazil, you know, would not be silent anymore and would express their views, would make their voices known in order for us to build a world after the situation of the crisis in which we are not going to depend that much on the bilateral linkages or connections or the disconnections between China and the US. Finally, I think everything will depend on very much on the attitude of companies themselves, whether the decoupling is going to be there or not, whether trade is going to be highly affected. I think it's early to have a final position on that. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Marcos, thank you. Thank you so much for more than remarks. It was another presentation and a very good one. I face an enormous challenge, which is many people have sent messages, questions. What I'm going to do, what I'm going to try to do here is to cluster them according to certain topics so that we can cover more or less all of them. And the first cluster is related to a sort of suspicion that the pandemic is not, or the pandemic's not over in China. That China is still vulnerable to a second wave of the pandemic. So the question is this true? Is the Chinese government prepared to face a second wave on both fronts, on the sanitary front and on the economic front? And I will ask these questions. I will ask Arthur to answer these questions first.
Yeah, I think the answer is that this is something of a concern. There have been a large number of people coming back into China, mostly students and other Chinese people living abroad, who in March concluded that it was much safer to be in China than anywhere else. They came back. This led to an increase in the number of imported cases. And the government has been struggling to keep these under control. And the result of this is my colleagues in Beijing tell me that actually in Beijing, particularly, the controls on, you know, going out of your house and so forth have been increased somewhat in recent days. So there is a bit of a challenge there. I think the government is still basically trying to get the country back to work, as Ambassador Caramuru said. But there is a, you know, I think there is a risk there. And I think there's also potentially a risk in that they seem to have not been very straightforward in reporting asymptomatic cases of the virus, which turned out to be very large. And so it is possible that even imported cases aside, that there is that you could see a secondary outbreak. So this is one of the reasons why I think that the return to economic normalcy has to be so slow, because you have to basically go step by step to get things back to normal, so that you don't have another outbreak. So at the moment, the problem seems like it's under control, but there's definitely some risk out there.
Good. Another cluster. Oh, there is still in this first cluster of questions. It is a suspicion that hovers over some minds, which is was the outbreak of the disease in China a deliberate act of China, or was something that happened in spite of the Chinese will?
Yeah. So on that, there are a lot of conspiracy theories about this. You know, one conspiracy theory is that this virus originated in a bioweapons lab in Wuhan. That has been completely debunked by serious research. There is another conspiracy theory that unfortunately has been promoted by the official spokesman of China's own Ministry of Foreign Affairs, namely that the virus was engineered by US bioweapons experts and planted in China. And that I would also, I bring this up in part because I differ a little bit from Ambassador Caramuru. I think that China's responses are sometimes soft and they're sometimes wild and crazy. And for a Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesman to get up and lend credence to that kind of ridiculous conspiracy theory, I think is not a moderate response. It is a very unreasonable one. And I think that is, you know, one of the problems that we now have in the relationship. But to answer the substantive question, yeah, there are a lot of conspiracy theories. They're all false. It is very clear that this is a virus that originated naturally, probably in an animal host, at some point jumped to humans, and it got out of control, and it was no one's fault. It was no one's design. It's just a bad thing that happens, and a bad thing that is frankly likely to happen again in the future. So we should take this epidemic as a cautionary tale for something that we need to be prepared for in future.
All right, the second cluster of questions has to do with American and Chinese foreign policy, and in Arthur's words, their efforts to command the narrative. And my question would be to Marcos Caramuru. Do you think this more nationalistic, inward-looking narrative that at least parts of the Trump administration and significant parts of the Republican Party tend to embrace, do they think that this is appealing to other actors of the international systems compared to the narrative which is being engineered by the Chinese government?
Well, I tend to believe that the only country that can have this nationalistic approach or attitude without paying that much attention to the business with China is the United States. I think all the other countries pay a lot of attention to business. They are subject to a lot of pressure from businessmen and companies that operate in China. And they tend to be more cautious when they approach Chinese issues and when they talk to the Chinese authorities. So I think that, you know, perhaps in the United States, you have this kind of freedom that you don't have elsewhere. And the other countries are going to be much more guided by what they see in their business community in terms of their approach to China, in terms of their expectations about business with China, in terms of with their investments in China.
Would you say that this, as we can tell from this point in time, this whole thing tends to play out in a way that will give the upper hand to China in the foreseeable future?
Well, I think, as I said in my short comments, I think that China is going to use this opportunity to increase its level of connection with the international world, isn't it? Both in terms of investments and in terms of trade. And also China is going to pay a lot of attention to Europe in particular, because a few countries in Europe have already become closer partners to China. Italy, for example, or Portugal. So there's a general perception there's no more consensus in Europe to deal with China. The doors are open. And China is being very competent in building connections, in building a good dialogue with countries like Germany, with countries like France. So I think that everything depends very much on, as I said, on the business and on how China is able to seize this connection with the other countries, in particular the Europeans. There's also the case of Japan and East Asian countries, isn't it? I think if you think at this cooperation that China has had during the crisis with different countries and sending aircrafts and all that, Japan was included. And I think China wants to use this opportunity to see how much it can improve its connections with Japan and its dialogue with the Japanese authorities. So I really don't see other countries joining the United States that easily.
All right.
Yeah, can I just, Sergio, can I just make a quick addition to that? Yeah, so I basically agree with everything that Ambassador Caramuru just said. I think that's very apt, and it's actually striking in Europe that I think there's a strong feeling in Italy that they've kind of been abandoned by the rest of the EU, but that China has been very helpful. So I think the dynamics that Marcos alluded to there are very real. The one addition I would make is that to the degree that your question implied a question of, is there a major change in the balance of power or global influence between China and the US? I think it's a little bit early to say. I think, clearly China will try to take advantage of this. But let's remember back in 2008 and 2009, there were a lot of similar statements about how this proved that the US was in big trouble and that China was going to take over and be the biggest economy in the world by now. And the reality since then has been much more complicated. So we should be a little bit cautious about drawing really long-term 5-10-year conclusions about complex international systems from the short-term impacts of the moment.
All right, we are approaching the end of this conversation, but let me get back to you, Arthur. To ask you, you've mentioned that hawks in the Trump administration see this as an opportunity to strengthen their political position, right? But what's the role? How President Trump sees this situation? Does he tend to have a more nuanced approach to China? And since we're getting closer to the election process in the United States, how the election process will fit in this U.S.-China relationship?
Yeah. So I would not call President Trump's approach to China or anything else nuanced. Nuance is not his thing. It is definitely more erratic, though. So he's not adhering to some careful strategic plan. He's sort of dancing in the moment. And he does that on everything. And you've seen that in this case. He's alternated between saying, oh, the virus is all China's fault. We've got it under control. Everything is fine. If anything is bad here, it's China's fault, to saying, oh, President Xi's doing a great job and we had a great conversation, et cetera. He specifically made a point of referring to the coronavirus as a quote unquote Chinese virus, which was very offensive, rightly so, to the Chinese government. But then he pivoted. So I think what we can see about President Trump is that he personally is not committed to this, viscerally committed to this concept of strategic rivalry between the US and China. He's a businessman. He thinks, if we can get a good deal to do business, then that's good. And that's what his trade deal was all about. But he is also someone who loves posturing, toughness, and has essentially enabled all of the most hardline, aggressive militarist people in the US government a free hand most of the time to do whatever they want, right? And this is completely unprecedented. No other president in American history has been so reckless, frankly, in permitting these extreme partisans of a particular hardline point of view to have so much influence. So every so often he reins them in because it's bad for his trade deal or whatever. But he's, in my opinion, being quite irresponsible most of the time in allowing these people as much purchase as they have on policy. So what you see is that there's these wild swings in US policy between let's make a deal, let's do a trade deal, we can be cooperative, to no, let's make China enemy, let's cut off Huawei. And I suspect that that will continue because Trump's political calculus is creating uncertainty and changing positions with the moment based on what he sees. So I think it's really impossible to know how things are going to play out over the next 6 months because they will change from month to month according to his political desires. And I think the final thing I would say on this is I've put a lot of emphasis on the hawkish elements of the administration. There are others. I mean, the Treasury Department and other parts of the administration have pushed for a much more sort of traditional, if you will, competitive, but also cooperative relationship with China. It seems like Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, is basically in that camp, and he's been kind of pushing in that direction. And as I noted, there's a lot of cooperation actually going on at the subnational level between local governments in the US and China to promote the transfer of supplies and so forth. So it's a very complicated mixed picture, and it's going to remain complicated and messy. My concern is that whatever Trump's desires may be, it does seem clear that the power of the most hardline faction in Washington continues to grow. And just as Ambassador Caramuru said, this is an opportunity for China to do various things, many of which are highly constructive in the world. I think the people in DC who are pushing this kind of line also see it as this is their opportunity to push something forward, and they're going to keep doing that.
Okay, before I hand it over to Julia to close this conversation, let me ask a final question about Brazil, and it has to be to Marcos Caramuru. Against this backdrop of U.S.-China relationship that we have sketched here, what are the opportunities for Brazil in the threats to Brazil in the short term, in the midst of the pandemic and the global recession, and going forward?
Well, first and foremost, the opportunities are going to be in the export of food and I don't know, and all these basic items that we export to China. I think that China, in face of this situation, is going to be even more worried about the idea of keeping a good relationship with these countries that can be important suppliers of these essential goods in the long run. And China is going to pay a lot of attention to that. And we should not think about the flows of exports this year or this month or next month, but I think that as a whole, China is going to be very much worried with that, and this will have to strengthen our relations with China. The most important thing to do, in my view, is to keep the dialogue going on, to keep the dialogue open with China, and to have a dialogue that does not incorporate any ideological view, any preconceived view, is an open dialogue, is a dialogue as rich as possible in many different areas, and then go ahead with it. China will also see many opportunities in the Chinese economy to invest. And we are going to need these investments. We are going to need investments in infrastructure. We are going to need investments in many different areas where China possesses the expertise, the resources available, and luckily so China already knows our reality in a number of these areas. So Chinese participation in investments in strategic areas in Brazil, like infrastructure, is going to be more and more important and essential when we try to rebuild the whole economy after all the economic impact of this virus. So what we have to do is to keep a good dialogue open without preconceived views, and go ahead with what we built with China we have built along the last few decades.
All right, now farewell remarks by Julia. I just would like to really thank you both, Marcos and Arthur. You covered a lot of ground. It was really interesting. And my excuses to many people who have sent their questions to me. I tried my best to address them as encompassing as I could. Now, Julia, please close the conversation.
Thank you so much, Sergio. Thank you, Arthur and Marcos, for this great presentation. We had about 350 people connected in Zoom, and I think more people on Facebook. A lot of people ask about the presentation. Arthur just replied that we can send to all the participants. So Fundação Fernando Henrique and CEBRI will send that. And then I'd like to thank you all for participating, and also invite you to our next CEBRI online debate that will happen next Monday at 6 o'clock about the oil and gas crisis with Jorge Camargo and Décio Doni. We're going to send the invitation also today. Okay, thank you all.
Okay, folks, bye-bye. Thank you so much. Marcos, very good to see you. Arthur.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you and goodbye.
Stay home.
Okay, yes, I will.
Yeah.
Okay, bye-bye.